Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Access Matters, Funders' Role in Advancing Accessibility in Media and Film. My name is Roshni Melia, and I'm a program consultant with Media Impact Funders. I'm a person with brown skin of South Asian descent and long black hair. Today, I'm wearing a white mock neck sweater. We have an exciting discussion ahead, but before we get started, I'd like to cover a few quick housekeeping items. First, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that this program stems from an idea shared by Abby Lord and Danae Peters from the Perspective Fund. Their input, along with the contributions of others, helped us surface the important issues and conversations shaping the field. So we're deeply grateful. Thank you so much, Abby and Danae. And now on to the housekeeping. As you know, this session was designed as a model for fully accessible online meetings. We have live captioning and ASL interpretation available throughout. To minimize distractions, especially for anyone using a screen reader, the chat will remain disabled during the discussion, but will open afterwards for essential items only, like resource links. And for the Q&A portion, you can engage in two ways. Type your question into the Q&A feature found in the More section of the taskbar, or you can use the Raise Hand feature if you'd like to ask your question live. When called on, please unmute yourself, share your name and pronouns if you wish, and then proceed with your question. So that's about it for the housekeeping. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator, Carrie Lozano, President and CEO of ITVS, who will guide today's discussion. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here. This is such an important conversation, and thank you Media Impact Funders for hosting this. ITVS has long been involved in accessibility and disability work, and I just want to thank everybody who has supported this work over time. Many of you are in this room. It's an evolving field and there's so much activity happening right now. So I can't think of a better moment to have this conversation. I wanted to start off by just reading a quote from 2019 from the legendary disability rights advocate Judy Uman, who many of you know. She wrote, "Much attention has been given of late to the need to increase diversity and representation in the media. But rarely is disability referenced as part of that diversity. As many in the disability advocacy community are saying, it's time to put the D, disability, in diversity. Media must begin to see those of us with all types of disabilities and from all backgrounds as part of a society and as meaningful contributors. We need to see reflections of both the diversity and commonality of our stories." So that's the goal today, to talk about how we achieve that, and where we've come, what we need to do, and the organizations that are doing this work. So I want to start off with Cassidy Diamond, who is the new executive director of Forward Doc. So Cassidy, tell us a little bit about Forward Doc, about the goals that you're setting to achieve, and about the work that we need to do.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you all for having me. This is Cassidy speaking. I am a white queer woman with a kind of mullet, mohawk, curly hair, short on the sides, brown with speckled gray, wearing a denim shirt in my cozy Chicago apartment. And as Carrie said, I am the new executive director of Forward Doc. We are a nonprofit officially titled Filmmakers with Disabilities. We've been around for about 6 years. And you know, we serve kind of two purposes, and some things that I kind of want to highlight for you all is what we need for our members and for our community, but also what we need as a disability-led organization in this industry. And so I think, you know, our first and foremost mission is to build community. This work against ending ableism and fighting for equity in our field, it is a long and tiring fight. And so part of what we do is just provide community for disabled makers and allies. We have 1,200 members across the globe. And that will always be central to what we do, as to be a place to skill build, to network, and to provide support for each other as we do work. Documentary is exhausting work to begin with, let alone when you're fighting against a lot of the systems in our industry that keep people from having access. So one of the things that we've really focused on is film festival accessibility. We launched the film event accessibility scorecard almost 3 years ago. And we came out with an impact report on that this past summer that really highlights the inaccessibility of film festivals and the reason why we chose that. We can drop links in there later. You all can read about it. But it showed that over 70% of film festivals are inaccessible. And film festivals are the place where independent makers get access to networking, to connections, to building their audiences, to meeting potential funders. And when they're inaccessible, filmmakers are kept from doing their jobs. So that's one of the main reasons why we focused on that. But in this new kind of iteration of Forward Doc 2, we want to focus on the creative side of filmmaking too, and the importance of having authentic representation both behind the camera and in front of the camera. Disabled stories have very often been told by non-disabled folks, which leads us to having our representation be in tropes. We hear a lot about the phrase inspiration porn, where disabled folks are looked at to be pitied, or they've overcome their disability to do XYZ. And that's mostly due to not having disabled people in the room during the process, whether it's in pre-production, production, the editing room. And so a lot of what we need to do is be advocating for more of that representation. And for us, that really leads to making sure there's opportunities for people with disabilities to have positions of power in the film ecosphere, whether that's in a production level role, being a producer level role where you can actually have a say in budgets, allocate funds for captioning and audio description, funds for hiring accessibility coordinators. That's also in arts administration, and that's also in the production type studio framework. So we just need more representation in general, and that's what we are really advocating for. And as an organization, it's been really interesting just starting this nonprofit journey to see the kind of barriers that we face as an organization trying to do this work. A lot of the technology that is out there, you think of some really common technologies that lots of startups use because they have great nonprofit discounts like Airtable. It's not screen reader accessible. So it really poses a barrier for folks like us to build an infrastructure, just build the systems that we need to build an equitable workforce so that that's reflected on the outside. So we're having to look into potentially building our own technology, being able to support full-time employment with decent benefits, the accommodations that folks need, and going into a year where we really don't know what's going to happen around what kind of support folks with disabilities are going to get through the federal government, let alone the kind of support that we are going to be able to offer folks. So I'll say that I'll kind of leave it there and let let everyone else speak. But I really want to, emphasize that the representation at the organizational level, whether it's a production company or an arts nonprofit, and having an accessible workspace is incredibly important for whatever work goes forward, because you cannot reflect that equity work and that access work externally unless you're doing it internally. And that's the thing that we really need support doing, is making sure that we can build accessible nonprofits, accessible art orgs, so that we can continue to do this work in a sustainable and equitable way. So that's kind of where we are as Forward Doc, the long story. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Cassidy. And I want to apologize that I forgot to give my visual description. I was saying before we got here that I haven't hosted a Zoom meeting in a very long time, so the technology actually makes me nervous. So I am a Latina woman with eyeglasses, middle age, short brown hair, and a black sweater with a necklace. And I have a really lovely filtered window behind me with black framing. So I'm, again, apologize for that. I want to move over to Richie Siegel, who has a few more years ahead of Forward Doc, really started at the beginning, kind of early pandemic, I would say, to work with scripted and narrative storytellers. So a lot of the same barriers, I imagine, Richie, as the documentary space, but tell us a little bit about your organization, the Inevitable Foundation, about the work that you've been doing and the barriers and also the opportunities that you see.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for being here. This is Richie speaking. I'm a white man with a reddish beard and brown hair, wearing a gray shirt with some photos of our billboards behind me that actually are very close, carried to some of the quote that you shared from Judy about disability as part of diversity. Doc actually has been doing this a few more years than us. We're like mid toddler, and Doc's maybe like upper toddler. But I started Inevitable Foundation with my co-founder Marissa about 4 years ago. Marissa is a disabled writer herself, and we originally kind of started the organization thinking about how, in a world that is rampant with ableism and disabled people are very rarely in positions of power generally. How could we leverage the power of storytelling to really change that? And for us, I think from a scale perspective, partially from a scale perspective and partially from an experience perspective, we really started on the narrative and on the scripted side. And we talk about our work as really like a workforce-driven narrative change model. So I think, again, very similar to some of what Cassidy was talking about. This is all about building power for disabled storytellers. We came into an industry in 2020, 2021, where there was very little narrative control for disabled people. Most stories had nothing to do with disabled people in any creative position of power. They were being hired as consultants. They were being not even hired, but asked to do free work. And it was really clear to us that if you want to create an environment where disabled people are in control of their stories and can use the power of this medium for good, that all starts with the storyteller and really investing deeply in them. We primarily have worked on the scripted narrative side and built a lot of roots and done a lot of work in kind of the quote unquote entertainment industry side. We're starting to explore some of our doc work now and with a specific focus on the distribution side where we think there's tons of need and tons of opportunity. But one just anecdote I would share is I think just in a lot of philanthropic conversations we've had, there can be a lot of fear about the scripted side. Like I think philanthropy broadly is a lot more comfortable on the doc side, and there are very great reasons for that. But I think even just in this past weekend, I think most people know that Wicked is happening right now and is very much a topic of conversation. And the data came out yesterday that 8.7 million people saw Wicked in the last 5 days. There's a disabled character in that movie. I would say I'm not aware of many other opportunities where 8 million people have seen a disabled character, and you can debate the merits of that representation and so forth. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for us on the scripted side, and the scale of that is really kind of exciting. I think in terms of the work we do, three main buckets. We do a ton of grant making and mentorship work. So we are an intermediary ourselves. We will end this year having granted $1 million in the last 3 years or 4 years, excuse me, to disabled writers and filmmakers, which we're incredibly proud of. We have a research and advocacy arm to our work, which is tons of billboard campaigns, some of which are behind me, as well as an increasing roster of research around accessibility in the production landscape, research around the power of disabled audiences and trying to really shift this from, talking about costs of accessibility to investments, talking about oh, we must placate this audience to let me harness the power of this audience, the 60 million people in America, the billion people globally. And then finally, we do a lot of workforce development work about really investing in these storyteller success. And, I would say set up a little bit of a bold kind of standard, which is, we said when we started this in 2021, if we are successful, we want to self-destruct. So this is not meant to be a 100-year project. I think if we're doing the same work and having the same conversations in 20 years, 10 years, like we have to really go look in the mirror at ourselves and is this actually working? And so we've tried to take a pretty aggressive stance on, we can do some work and like meet people where they are. And also like, please meet us where we are as well. And we've been very proud to build a majority disabled board and majority disabled team. And I come to this from the ally perspective, which is in our space, about 1% of the writers and filmmakers in the entertainment industry have disabilities. So my question is, what are the other 99% doing to change that, and not just making this all about the 1%? And that, yes, disabled people absolutely need to be in positions of power and give voice, but there's a lot that other people can do to really push this work as well. So that's hopefully a little bit of background on us.
Thank you, Richie. Just, thinking about this conversation and talking to all of you, I'm struck by the complexity of the need. There's what's happening in terms of representation. There's what's happening in terms of physical access. There's being behind the camera, if you will. And then there's just accessibility on the screen and being able to participate in screenings. So there's really different lanes, I guess, in terms of, where we need to focus our work. And I know it's helpful for me to break those things up here at ITVS. We have to look at things. I see my colleague, Beatrice Castillo, who works a lot with our in-person engagement. So I just want to say that for the funders, that if that's helpful, in thinking of these things in different terms. And I want to go to you, Keisha, with IDA. And if you could talk a little bit, IDA has been having this conversation for actually quite a long time. I think, if I'm not getting the history wrong, Forward Doc was founded out of a panel at IDA that maybe even Renell, who I see, might have curated. So there's a long history there. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that the IDA is doing now, and kind of the space that it wants to hold in terms of what we need to do moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, and thanks, Rushni and Shannon at Media Impact Funders. I'm really thrilled to be on this panel. Keisha Nicole Knight, brown-skinned lady with short hair, looking a little bit like a 19th century abolitionist today for some reason, with a blurred background and coming from Los Angeles, California. I'm the director of funds and advocacy at the International Documentary Association. And to your point, Carrie, and what you were saying before, we're actually coming at this from the perspective of a funder. That's how most recently, and I joined IDA about 2.5 years ago, and I joined it at a time when we were actually developing a fund for disabled nonfiction media makers. And part of that, where we started with that, was around research. And actually, I'll just drop in the chat right now a link that I think you all should have gotten before, but to some slides on the recommendations that came out of that research process, the Nonfiction Access Initiative. And one of the things that we did, instead of us as a legacy organization that does not identify as disability-led, what was our role in supporting the community? These were the questions we were asking. And part of the research process was actually, well, all of the research process was bringing in community members, different groups, disability-led groups, different disabled artists, filmmakers, activists, to help us think about what we could do. And what came out of this process was, in fact, that we didn't ourselves necessarily need to set up a fund. In fact, what we were understanding was that the community was not interested in IDA as a non-disabled led organization leading this work. So we really had to think about what we could do as an organization committed to field building in particular. And from that, like you said, Carrie, we have kind of a history of incubation. So this incubation process started, again, with another group of an advisory committee. And from that, the International Access Consortium was created, and it's going to be launched. To use Richie's toddler, pre-toddler, we're new board here, just literally incorporated as a nonprofit organization. Interim executive director is Renell Schubert. The board chair is Lawrence Carter Long. Folks, really, we have an international board that's really interested in doing this work and has been doing this work for decades. And what the International Access Consortium actually is developed to address is, Richie mentioned power building, is that we recognize that in the funding space, this is not particular to the disability community, but in the funding space, organizations that are marginalized or led by marginalized populations are often set up to compete with one another. And this competition leaves folks really limited in capacity. And so our goal with the International Access Consortium was to create a collective of organizations that could fundraise at scale. And in addition to that, build sustainability, build business know-how, build ways so that there's a true sustainable kind of grassroots disability-led organizations around media, disabled media makers. And so it's coming, it's about to launch, and we're really excited to have been a part of that. I will say that as a part of this entire process, though, IDA has also recommitted to making sure, based on these findings, the recommendations from the NAI report, that we're still deeply kind of integrating access into all of our processes in our funds department. So that's also something. It's not to kind of say, you know, access is here and we're here. It actually is something that we're still integrating into everything. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, thank you for that. It's nice to have these different organizations at different years of development. Cassidy, I'll go back to you, but I would love for each of you to weigh in, and then we'll open it up for questions. You know, we have a group of funders and people who are interested in this work, who want to support both filmmakers and organizations, who want to support representation. Let's have some brass tacks about this, because I think unless you've been doing this work and even, you know, working with media impact funders on this, it's like there's a lot to learn, actually. And there's a lot to budget for. There's a lot to think about if you want to do this work well and to be accessible organizations. Can we have some real, like, concrete ideas in terms of what does it take to do this well in terms of resources? And how can the folks in this room be really supportive of both filmmakers and organizations?
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. This is Cassidy speaking. You know, I think one of the things I've talked about with Amanda Upson, who was Forward Doc's interim director for the past couple years, is, you know, in a lot of ways, we've spent the past 4 years just proving to our industry that disabled filmmakers exist, which feels a bit like banging your head against a wall constantly. But to that end, it means that we've had to do a lot of work creating case studies and access guides and tools for folks to say, not only are we here, but give people, you know, to your point, Carrie, kind of brass tacks, how do we actually implement some of this? So I'll drop in the chat once it's open some of the tools and resources we have, both for accessible filmmaking. There was a case study done that Forward Doc sponsored with Netflix and BFI around Crip Camp that really outlines how to build in accessibility into the documentary filmmaking process from beginning through exhibition. To that point, we also have some really great case studies on film festival accessibility, case studies of things that have worked, like at the New Orleans Film Festival captioning requirement, to our impact report on what hasn't. And I think to kind of tag into what Keisha was saying, I want folks to be thinking about access as not just like, oh, we're going to put money in Forward Doc and then we've checked our access budget. It's like, how do we think about how we're building access into everything that we're funding, right? 70+% of film festivals that were surveyed in our scorecard were inaccessible. I guarantee you that the majority of those film festivals receive grant funding. So it's also about how do we hold everyone in this ecosystem accountable for accessibility. To Richie's point, it's not just on those of us with disabilities to constantly be advocating. It's what can our allies do? And I think as funders, that's a huge thing. You all hold a lot of power. And I would love to see more accountability and funding for folks across the board around accessibility. That accessibility is thought of when someone is holding a screening, when someone is doing an impact campaign, when someone is producing a short film, that they're required to show how they're building access into that. I know IDA is working on a new budget that we worked on a little bit with Robert Behar, a new budget template that's got accessibility baked in at every level, right? So it's an example of how can we hold everyone in our ecosystem accountable, right? This isn't just on folks with disabilities or organizations with disabilities or disability-led. How do we hold everyone in our ecosystem accountable to being accessible? That requires helping people fund accessibility, but also make sure that folks are budgeting for it in the things that you're giving them funding for, and that they're actually implementing it. And that there's some accountability there, because that is what helps, to Richie's point, making this century-long fight a lot shorter if we're all a little more accountable and a little more involved in the process. And then, it is listen to people with disabilities, listen to organizations that are disability led. People with lived experience are just going to be more reflective internally in their work and externally, and giving people those access to power. Money is power, proximity, decision making is power. Thinking of the ways that we can kind of level the playing field is really important. I don't take it for granted that as a queer woman with a disability, I'm an executive director. Like, I hold a lot of power. And so I know that, like, whatever I am going to do in my position, I want to bring more people with us. And I just want everyone in these positions of power to be thinking about that. I think a lot of folks with disabilities have been discounted, and that's because our media and our narrative don't have great representation, right? It's all a circle. So how do we change that narrative by the stories we tell, while also giving people access at all levels with disabilities, access to power, whether it's a producer in philanthropy, in an arts org. That's really the brass tacks. But we have, those toolkits, those case studies for you all to see things that have actually worked well, which we will share. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there, Carrie.
Thank you. I mean, Richie, I have the same question for you, but I'd
Yeah.
also like you to address one other thing, which we talk about a lot in the documentary space, and I think is just true of our society, is a lot of times people with disabilities don't self-identify for the very reasons that that we're talking about today, of not wanting to be boxed in, or feeling marginalized. So I'm wondering if you could both, you can talk about the brass tacks, but I'm wondering if you could talk about that as well. And this idea, I didn't actually realize that there was a disabled character in Wicked, so now I want to go and see it and experience that. But talk a little bit about the challenge of both trying to make progress, but in a space where sometimes people are very hesitant to self-identify.
Yeah, I'll just add a lot, just agree and add to a lot of what Cassidy just talked about. So I think part of what Cassidy was getting at is, like, we as organizations fighting for this narrative change are also subject to the narratives we are trying to change. Like, there's some, like, building the plane while you're flying it metaphor in there. And so I think just to add on, like, and also to what Keisha said, the two things we hear the most that I think are really frustrating to hear are, one is disability is not part of our strategy, accessibility is not part of our strategy. And I think our answer to that is, you don't need a new strategy for this. Every strategy you have is currently suffering because you are not doing this. And I think we're trying to really push hard to get some mindset kind of shift happening there, because every other strategy, whether it's BIPOC people, whether it's climate, we can find every intersection of disability with every single issue every single funder cares about. And so there's a lot of work, I think, trying to just really shift and reframe. And Ford has some great language around disability inclusive versus disability specific grant making. And the inclusive is, we need to put this into everything. The specific is, we need a specific pile or bucket of money and support for this. And the answer is both. It's not one or the other. So I think there's a lot there that we are hopefully with other organizations and peers trying to really push on. I think the second part of that is around, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. The second part of that is around just accessibility, I think, generally. And is everyone saying like this is all just additive to unlock the existing impact that's already happening? I think in some ways, we often find, and Cassie was making this point, that like if disabled people are in charge, we spend very little, there's very little time spent debating the merits of these things. We can just go do the work. We can just go work on the creative. And I think part of what's, again, somewhat well-intentioned happened is there's all this ongoing conversation about these incredibly 101 things. And the reality is when disabled people are in charge, we can get to the 501, the 1001. You can get into PhD level stuff very quickly because we don't need to debate these things. They can just kind of happen. So I think that goes again back to the leadership piece. And I think related to that, Carrie, to your question, generally, we've talked to a lot of people. We serve a very wide range of disabilities. I think we're working on our annual report right now, and there's 33 spread across the 100 different creatives we support this year. Disabilities, some people have multiple, others have individual. And you can get really caught up really quickly in, okay, HR disclosure, is this illegal, like blah, blah, blah. And generally speaking, when the culture is right, the leadership is right, people are generally very open to disclosing because they feel that there's psychological safety and there's trust and there's a lot there. And so I think that all goes back to the culture and the leadership question, which is if people are not disclosing, if we're going, okay, probably post-COVID, 30% of the population has some sort of disability, but our grantee pool, our films we're funding are at 3% and 5%. Yes, there's a lot of work to do. And even if we're under indexing by 3x, for us, it's 1% of all writers and filmmakers with disabilities. Great. 3x under reporting. Okay, we're 3%. It doesn't really change a lot in the grand scheme of things. And so I think we're trying to really push on that. And the last thing I just say is I think the other thing that Keisha touched on that I want to just highlight is the amount of times we hear, oh, we already picked one organization, we've taken our bet, we were not here for this. Again, just leaving opportunity on the table because we all need to be doing a lot of this work from different angles all together. I'm not aware of any single organization that has ever solved a systemic problem without the support of their peers. And I think, again, trying to shift from that zero sum to the grow the pie mentality feels really important because we actually want to really work together, but the politics get really uncomfortable really quickly if we know we're competing for grants or for funders. And again, it just harms the underlying strategy. So I hope some of that touches on, Carrie, what you were hoping for.
Can I
Sure,
just
absolutely.
jump in real quick? This is Cassidy speaking. And Richie, I want to thank you for that. And also just say we're talking about 1 in 4 Americans at a minimum are identifying as having a disability. We aren't talking about a 1% of the population here. But the funds are to Richie's point, it's like, okay, we have one organization representing 25% of a population. It just doesn't make sense. Disability is the most intersectional identity. It intersects with so many other identities. When you get into multiple marginalizations and the way that impacts how we need to show up for our folks and how folks show up to work and their ability to disclose and feel safe. Maybe they feel safe with us, but as the industry as a whole, definitely not, right? And so how do we continue to build that trust? And to Richie's point, we as orgs need to be building coalitional power together, which seems a lot in line with what the IAC is doing. But that also it's not neither. The problem is so large. We're all tackling different parts of it. We're not actually competing in the work. We're all doing very similar work, and our work feeds into each other and actually is very necessary and supports each other's work. Inevitable working a lot. I know y'all are working into film festivals now, but like working in narrative and with writers and where we've been working in documentary, like that's shared power right there. That is building coalitional power. That is not competing, and they're both very necessary. So I just wanted to jump in there, Richie, because I thank you for that, because I think very often we get pitted against each other. I think we see that in all kinds of other marginalized communities where we're just being pitted against very restricted funds, and that in no way is ever going to help us see the kind of change that we need.
Yeah. And I would just add really quickly, I would love 10 other organizations trying to do what we're doing in some form. Like I would truly love that. But again, because of these scarcity issues that we're talking about, it's very hard to actually like build that field, so to speak. So in some ways, please bring on more quote unquote competition. We would love it.
And more collaboration, right? I mean, I think that's the thing, is that if we're all working together and learning from each other, and sharing resources as much as we can. I think that's something we all need to do in general as we're trying to make progress. Keisha, I want to ask you one more question, and then I really do want to open it up to conversation for all the attendees. You can put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll address your questions. These are the group of people, and I think at least for me, there are no dumb questions here. To Richie's point, a lot of us do need the 101, but sometimes, there's nitty-gritty things that you're all dealing with, or questions you have about your grantees or people you're supporting. But Keisha, I happen to know that recently IDA really helped an ITVS film have an in-person experience where there was a theater that didn't have a ramp, and one of the participants needed accessibility to get up to the stage. And you all literally built a ramp, worked with somebody and built a ramp. So this gets very, like, that's a very real thing, not just about the filmmakers, but also about the people who are in them and their ability to participate, which was something we all saw with Crip Camp as well, particularly at Sundance. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of that idea of just jumping in to make something possible, and to make something accessible, and what that takes as an organization to do that.
Thanks, Carrie, for that. I think it maybe is actually just an example of what Richie and Cassidy were talking about before about community and action. I was first actually quite ashamed that we had chosen a theater that was a very well-respected theater in Oakland, California, because that's what the filmmakers want. So we were like, let's make this happen. And then we realized that it wasn't accessible. And so I'm lucky to have Jim Lebrecht's phone number. And so that's who I call immediately. Jim, what am I supposed to do? Like, how am I supposed to feel? And I kind of actually, as an ally, I do want to say, because I'm sure maybe some funders are coming for this place, like all of these feelings are okay. As you were saying, Carrie, there are no dumb questions. There are also no dumb feelings. Like, I think that there is a certain level of erasure that happens around disability, a huge amount of erasure, right? And with that, we also, folks who don't identify as disabled aren't able to ask the dumb questions, to like be educated, to, so Jim is my safe space and someone that has been a huge rock throughout this entire process. Called Jim, said, Jim, and Jim's like, Keisha, it's okay. This is who you need to call in Oakland to get a ramp. Called the person with the ramp. They donated their services and we built the ramp to get it done. That would not have happened without the entire buy-in of the filmmakers as well, which also goes to the way that the filmmakers organized their film. Their entire process was completely ethical, and their commitment to access, whether it be economic access, whether it be for incarcerated folks, for folks who identify as disabled, all the way through. And so I kind of just wanted to speak and then let everybody ask questions, but this is all cumulative. The ethos we put, like everything is everything kind of thing. It's not like, if, helping access also, as Richie and Cassidy were saying, kind of intersects with so many different things and develops the atmosphere and the culture that we live in, so that we can then activate things quickly because everyone's on board. So thanks for bringing that up, Carrie. We were really happy to make that happen for Sitawa, and it was a big success.
Well, I think it's important that, we understand that there's a lot of kind of invisible work that we would never know, in that experience that happened, to make that possible, and how important that really is. And so I want to open it up to questions. You can either raise your hand. If you can figure that out in Zoom, talk about inaccessibility sometimes. Zoom can be really hard. You can put something in the Q&A. I'd love to hear from folks. You've got a group of experts here, who can answer any question that you might have.
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID.
Amanda, welcome, Amanda. Are you asking a question?
I think she's likely
No.
connecting her interpreter to the call.
Okay. I'm happy to, I'm comfortable with silence to get those questions rolling. I will say that that idea of cumulative action, of learning, at ITBS, our team works with stations, public media stations around the country to help make their events accessible. And we hope that that's a generative act, that then they just start doing that with all of their engagement, seed that in their communities. So we think that's incredibly important. Sarah, please welcome and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Sarah Napoli. I use she, her pronouns. White woman, long blonde hair. Really loved this conversation today. And I just was wondering, there's a lot of talk about accessibility, and I was curious, like in the industry, from your perspective, what is happening around training and education. I'm a learning services director for the Disability and Philanthropy Forum, and I'm curious what's happening specifically, as you can tell so far in the industry. Like, we can do access till the end of days, but until we actually have like a systems change with the industry, I feel like access is not going to be thought of from the get-go. So what have you seen as far as like systems changed around training and education within this industry specifically? Because that's something I'm really, really interested in. And do you see that change happening? I know it's a slow moving train, but what is happening currently around that, and where sort of, and I think as from a funding perspective for the folks on the call that are funders, where can that be directed potentially into a funding need around training and learning?
Thank you. That's a great question. And anybody, Cassidy, do you want to start?
Yeah, this is Cassidy speaking. Roshni, can you open the chat so I can start sharing some links? So I would love, I mean, this is a great question because there are really great people doing work out there. And so I feel like, first of all, I'm just going to drop the toolkit that Forward Doc created in here with Netflix around Crip Camp, which is just a toolkit for accessible documentary filmmaking. So that's a great place to start. But as we talk about systems, I 100% agree. If it's not systematized, if we're not kind of forcing people's hands, how do we do it? So we've looked a lot at the kind of path of intimacy coordinators have taken, which we've seen kind of on the rise. And so there has been a rise over an unequal amount of time around accessibility coordinators. So accessibility coordinators, you'll start seeing popping up definitely more in the US and a bit in the UK. And the role of an accessibility coordinator is to oversee the onset accessibility, right? So depending on the budget and how you've budgeted for a person, in an ideal world, that person is on in pre-production to help you set your budget, to also help you location scout, to help you make an accessible casting process if you're in narrative, you know, all of that along the way. And then they are there to help facilitate the accessibility needs of anybody on the cast or crew. And so that whether that's through catering or physical access or language access or communications access, whatever that is, that can be, you know, when we think about access, that can mean dietary restrictions, that can mean second language, like, you know, non-native English speaker access. Like, when we think about access coordinators, it's not just, again, when we're talking about this idea of universal design, it's not just making a set accessible for folks with disabilities, it's making that set more accessible for everyone. So I'll drop in a link here. There's a great, one of our members has a company called Indivisible Entertainment, and she actually just started a production accessibility coordinator fellowship program where she does training with folks with disabilities. Part of what we're also trying to do is get more folks with disability in these roles, right? Obviously, folks with disabilities want to also be DPs and be ADs. They don't want to just necessarily fill the role of accessibility, but also, again, the more folks we have with disabilities on set. I will say that before I went to Forward Doc, I worked for a company called Full Spectrum Features out of Chicago, where I was focused on accessibility there. I still say we because I only left them a few months ago, but they are a narrative mostly company, though we did release one hybrid documentary last year, Desire Lines, which premiered at Sundance. And our main goal was to go beyond accessibility coordinators to get access producers as a qualified position. Again, to that point of saying, an access coordinator doesn't have decision-making power. They can only recommend things and they can be vetoed by the director or the producer at any point. So how do we get people in those roles as producer, again, from pre-production that's helping oversee the budget and the fundraising? So, but they're also there to bring in the team to help coordinate about authentic representation. Maybe the story focuses on a deaf character and making sure there's someone that is familiar with deaf culture that can come in and review the script and make sure that this is an authentic representation, to making sure captioning and audio description are budgeted for the distribution. And so what we were doing is we've been lobbying the state of Illinois. I'm in Chicago, to get access producers and access coordinators on the tax credit, because we have a really robust tax credit. And our thinking is once we get it on the tax credit, people will start seeing it as a legitimate position that they can then even maybe get money back for. And it's a way to kind of systematize those roles like you were talking about. And so we created the access producer role at Full Spectrum. Matt Lauterbach, if anyone's familiar with All Senses Go, he's been our access producer here in Chicago and basically overseeing every production that goes through Full Spectrum. So they're a company to watch. Even though I'm not there, they had been committed to accessibility before I started. I jumped in and they're continuing that trend. So there are folks out there that are trying to kind of, to your point, systematizing this access roles to make them not only credited roles on IMDb, but also tax credit applicable. I hope that answers.
And I would just add one thing on top of what Cassidy said. I think so much of what is embedded in what you just shared is this is an industry, this is a medium, a practice. It's about making stuff. So we can train and educate all we want, but if nothing gets made, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And so I think the kind of funder part of that is, in some ways, the advantage the documentary field has with funders is there's a huge track record of funding docs. The narrative space does not have that. And I think across both spaces, we need to fund the orgs. We need to build capacity for all of us, whether it's for doc, IEC, et cetera. But we need more project funding too, because otherwise there's no opportunity to put this into practice. And so that, I think, is a huge gap we're seeing now, which is a lot of hesitation and fear around funding projects. But we only can build the systems and the learnings by doing the work. And this happens in reality, not conceptually.
Actually, this is Keisha. Just to add to that, great segue, Richie. That's Sarah, to your point, the Nonfiction Access Initiative that IDA came up with, which I dropped some findings into the chat earlier, that was actually geared toward funders. And part of those recommendations that came directly from folks who were making disabled media makers in the industry were unrestricted funding, flexible financial support, something that y'all don't know. Sometimes if people get too much funding, it negatively affects their benefits, right? So how do you organize things like that? Decentering competition, the idea of crip time and really honoring that and working that into how you're thinking about a budget. And then all of this leading to attitudinal shift. So thinking about, there's a certain systems change that can happen also, not again at the burden of the disabled-led organizations, but on the funder side as well. How can we organize our processes so that we are actually creating the space for those systems to change? And Ronelle Schubert, who was now the interim the interim executive director at IAC, and was our program manager of NAI at IDA, actually held convenings at we actually took this internationally to IDFA and different virtual convenings with funders all over the world to really start to kind of get them into this space. And we hope that we'll be able to continue to do that work kind of in the coming years as well.
Thank you,
Actually, Carrie,
Keisha.
can I jump
Yeah,
in one
sure.
time real quick as well? This is Cassidy speaking. And I thank you, Keisha. I think that that point is huge. And I also wanted to give a really solid example of kind of institutionalizing this, the creative side, because I will always be here to advocate money for Forward Doc and give us all the money so we can do all the work. But I also want to give props to folks like an American Masters. They recently did a VIA incubator, which was run, actually Amanda Upson, who's in the room, and Dayal Mohammed, who are both on the board of Forward Doc. We're producers on this series Renegades in American Masters. It's a series of 5 short films around hidden disabled history. They were able to hire 25 top level disabled crew and over 100 spread across the other 5 films. And this was an incubation within PBS and American Masters. So it was not only saying, hey, we're going to give you the money and broadcast and do this, but we're also as an organization going to learn how to support disabled talent, right? So it's a kind of a both way of saying, we need organizations, they need training. Folks need to learn how to be inclusive, how to not be ableist, using the right language, just like any kind of marginalized identity, there's got to be training around that. So being able to support an organization to get that training, but then also have the money to support a project like this that has provided jobs for over 100 disabled makers. It was just renewed for season 2, I believe. And is also on the content side, telling authentic, important, hidden disability history. So it's a perfect example of something that's becoming institutionalized or has been part of the fabric of an existing organization that is developing really great talent and also content.
Thank you so much, Cassidy. This is Carrie and Adriana. That might be an answer to your question. I know I'm realizing that we're running short of time, but thank you for sharing that example. I think that's a really great example of a project that, no one's going to do everything right all the time. I think we all know that. That is making really specific efforts to do this work. And so I want to go ahead and go to Danae's question, and then Beatrice, I see your hand up, and that probably will be all the time we have. But Danae is asking, what do panelists want funders to ask in grant applications or grant consideration processes that they might not be currently asking? I think that's a fantastic question. And Richie, why don't we start with you?
Thinking. I think the initial things that come to mind, part of it, I think, is what Cassidy and Keisha were alluding to before, which is trying to shift a little. Like, again, I think that the disabled focus led organizations often get the most spotlight and kind of pressure and kind of the hardest questions around the strategy. And I think that's the like disability specific part, again, going back to the Ford structure. But again, if there was a report from the Disability Philanthropy Forum where Sarah's from. I'm pretty sure the stat was 10 cents of every $10 of philanthropic funding is going towards disabled focused and or led organizations. So the question is, where are the other $9.90 getting all the spotlight, and where's the pressure on them to start to do this work? So I think part of it is on that side. I think part of Danae, what you're getting at is like, where can a little bit of friction be added? Because I think we know that when things are rushed, when things move quickly, that's often when access goes out the window. So a healthy dose of friction to slow down and kind of think, I think is really important. And I think it goes back to the collaboration point of, again, if the vast majority of the money, time, energy is not going towards the disabled led projects, organizations, et cetera, what can all of the others do? Sorry, 1 penny of every $10, excuse me. Even worse. What can all the other organizations, players, projects do to make this change? Because we need both. We need both strategies working. It can't just be rely on disabled people and storytellers to do all of the work. Like, there have to be allies shifting and the power and investing and so forth. And I also think that goes back to the funders. Like, again, I think a lot of organizations are newer in a lot of these funder relationships. I think we've all had some like wonderful successes in terms of what we've been able to do. But there are organizations with a way longer term relationships with these funders that could be making recommendations, could be saying, hey, you should really go talk to this org or these people, or they're doing great work. And I think that collaboration and again, allyship feels like a really important part of the puzzle that just feels underinvested in right now, and will create more connective tissue between these all being related, work and strategies, and not, oh, the disability stuff's over here. We can do this one day a month, and then the other rest of the month we'll do all the normal work or whatever. And I think we're trying to really break those silos.
Well, to that point, a lot of organizations ask for a lot of data when they're granting to organizations, maybe their audited reports or about the diversity of their staff or their board. I mean, would it be even just a step forward to ask about the disability profile of their staff and their boards? I mean, is that a step forward, Cassidy, in terms of
Yeah.
just being something really specific that funders could be asking?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Carrie. This is Cassidy speaking. I think it's that accountability piece that we're really looking for, is to, in the reporting, obviously in your staff, that's really important, but also being reflected in your budget and requiring line items for accessibility. I think and to be able to not only there's a large federal grant that requires you to be accessible, and all you have to do is check a box kind of saying that you're going to make an accessible program at the beginning, and there's no follow-up in the end of what you actually did for accessibility, right? And to Richie's point, if you have a $50,000 budget and you only get $25,000 from a grantor, you're likely not. Some folks will throw accessibility out first. Oh, we didn't get all the funding, so we're going to throw that out. Well, where's the accountability afterwards that any of those line items are used? So just in the reporting, I think it would be really useful to not only, it's not just about hiring, but it's also about whatever you're building being accessible, whether it's a film screening, a festival, a film itself, making sure that folks are actually line iteming that. And then in addition, I would love to see eventually, to a maybe an organization that has proven this commitment. I don't know how, as funders, we can talk about it, Danae and others, but how do we add, an additional 10% or 5% of accessibility funding on top of funds requested? So, and if they're not actually being accounted for in the budget, like how are we saying this is accessibility specific funding, right? Like we're giving you this grant, and X percentage has to go for funding. You have to show the receipts for that. It builds in the accountability and then also allows folks to not be able to pull that money away from the funds that they already have. It's, I think there's ways that we can play with that that could be really interesting, but that accountability piece I think is really key, and not just in staffing. It's not just about representation. It's about building accessibility into every program and your organization and having that reflected. Your budget is a moral document. Your budget should reflect your commitment to accessibility.
That's right in general. And I'm hoping, Rashni, we have time to get Beatrice's question in, and then I think we're at time. Beatrice, go ahead.
Yes, I'll go quickly. My name is Beatrice Castillo, she, her pronouns. I'm a Latina woman with brown hair, brown skin. And I oversee our engagement program at ITVS. So really working with the finished product of films and getting them into communities all across the country. We work with hundreds of community partners, and the resources that you all provide, whether it's IDA or Forward Doc, have been super integral into the training of our partners. And we continue to provide training for them season after season. And we make it a requirement actually in our grants that they make their events accessible. So Keisha, I can really relate to the experience you had with the theater, and these are things that we come up against every day with our partners and their venues, and just how to make their events accessible. My question is for Cassidy, more specifically around the accessibility scorecard. I had an opportunity to read the impact report. I think that tool is incredibly important, and I'm just curious if you all have plans to open up that scorecard for filmmakers to use with their engagement and impact campaigns, and for community and local partners who are doing this work on the ground all across the country, so that they have access and we have another way to measure and evaluate how inclusive and accessible these events are.
This is Cassidy speaking. Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. I know you and I have talked a little bit about how the scorecard currently isn't really functional for kind of one-off screenings. It's more for festivals or organizational screenings. So what's really great is, the past 2.5, 3 years of the scorecard, Amanda Upson, the former interim director of Forward Doc, and I, we always joke, but it's true, we built it with duct tape and super glue. It was an incredibly not funded project that ended up doing really well, and really providing this necessary data that we need. There's such a dearth in data. And it's not just, it's providing data that then we can take to funders and show things, but then also helping you as a event organizer actually improve your events. Our goal this year now as a nonprofit going into like a more fully funded organization is to invest in the kind of revamping of the scorecard. And how do we make it more flexible to be able to work with different kinds of events? How can we also work to provide folks like you that are using it with usable data that you can then go to your funders or your CEO or your ED and make the case that you need to make. So that is 100% in the pipeline for this next year. We hope to also continue to be doing an impact report every 2 years. And we're hoping that we can show improved accessibility over time, that all of this work that everyone's doing is actually making a difference. Because like I said, there's just a dearth of data out there. So the scorecard is a really essential tool to what we're doing, and it needs some love. So we need some money. We're going to go out and fundraise and really be able to give it the justice it deserves to be able to function in the way that you need it to and so many other folks do. So it's been really wonderful so far, but it could use some love. So that's definitely on our priority for this next year for 2025.
Thank you, Cassidy, and thank you for the question. This is Carrie speaking, and I just want to say I think we already see the impact of all the work that all of you are doing. I know there's a long way to go, and there are a lot of resources that are needed, and there's a lot of systemic change that's needed. But there's no question, I've been doing this for a long time, that 20 years ago we weren't having these conversations, and so even just to be having the conversations, to be having the organizations committed to this work is a huge distinction. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about this and to be able to share with you all. Roshni, I'm going to hand it over to you. I don't know if there's other housekeeping, but thank you so much for all being here and for engaging in this work. And I look forward to seeing all the organizing and action that happens next.
Thank you.
Roshni.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you to our incredible panelists today, Cassidy, Keisha, and Richie, for sharing your insights and your experiences. We really appreciate it. This conversation was so rich and meaningful, and we're really excited to keep these discussions going as we collectively work to make this industry more accessible and inclusive. So thank you so much. In the coming weeks, we will be posting a recording of today's discussion on our website along with the captions. And before we close, I just wanted to mention 2 upcoming discussions that MIF is hosting. On December 10th, we'll host the second call in our Safeguarding Journalism and Media series. This series provides a space for funders and field experts to share strategies, resources, and support in response to the rapidly evolving challenges facing the media sector. And on December 16th, we'll hold our December Journalism Network call. So if you haven't registered yet, please be sure to do that. And so thank you all for being here today. And we look forward to connecting with you all soon. Thanks.